Well, welcome back to our study in the story of Jesus. And today we're actually in session 19. But before we jump into that, I wanted to just take a moment to again say just a little bit about my book. No, we're not going to be studying Jonah and the whale today. This is actually the blue whale of Catoosa. And it's found in Catoosa, Oklahoma, which is on Route 66. So this is one of 66 stops that are made in the book. And in the book, when you read each of the stops, and there's actually a plot line going on throughout the whole book, but at each stop, there's a little bit of a history of the stop given. So the story behind the blue whale, which is actually quite interesting, is on this stop. And then at each stop also, there's just a little bit of a synopsis of one of the books of the Bible. So again, as you read the book, you go through 66 stops on Route 66, and you go through just a little bit of a synopsis on each of the 66 books of the Bible, along with there being instructions on how to link over to a longer lecture on each of those books if you want to go a little bit deeper. So anyway, thought I just would again encourage you. You can go to Amazon and just stick my name in there and look for this book, The Road to Somewhere, and I'd appreciate you getting a hold of that. It means a lot that you would think enough to order one of those. Okay, so today we're getting to a point in the story of Jesus where we're really at a major turning point in my mind. We're in the sort of the third major area that Jesus ministers in out of four areas. So we're rapidly moving toward ultimately him moving into Jerusalem for the final week of his earthly ministry, what we call the Passion Week. And the turning point really has to do with the fact that partially he's geographically often on the other side of the Jordan River, kind of beginning again this journey to Jerusalem. And the major shift is that up till this point, there has been obviously a growing popularity. He's just fed the 5,000 and the 4,000. So there's really been masses of people following him, large crowds, a lot of popularity. But what begins to happen, and actually there's been a little bit of this going on throughout the entire Gospels as you're reading them, but it's really ramping up, and that is a conflict that Jesus has with the religious leaders of his day, particularly two groups, the scribes and the Pharisees, and we will look a little bit today at who those guys are and what the conflict is all about. But again, the key word I would say today is conflict. So as I've done in the past, although we're really chronologically, we're right where we should be and we've been tracking along. But as I've done in the past, there are numerous instances of conflict that Jesus has. So I'm taking what I think is, again, one of the classic conflicts, and we're going to focus our attention on that today. So it has to do with dinner. Jesus gets invited to dinner by one of the Pharisees that have been listening to him as he's been teaching, and it's what happens there at that dinner that creates the conflict. So Luke says it this way. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. So again, we see perhaps one of the Pharisees here inviting him to dinner. We see Jesus reclining at a table with a Pharisee and a group of his friends. A little later on, we're going to see how it's not just a Pharisee, that there's a group of people there. And one of the first things we recognize is that one of those men, and probably the one that invited him, has sort of a critical or a negative, disapproving look on his face as he's watching Jesus. And here's what's going on. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Now, this isn't a statement on the fact that Jesus was a dirty guy. And of course, there's nothing wrong and probably a good idea that we wash our hands before the meal, but that's not what this is about at all. Jesus has had this immense popularity. He's healed the sick, he's fed the multitudes. By this point in time, he's actually raised 2 children from the dead. Crowds everywhere he goes. But again, growing hostility. John the Baptist has been put to death, which means he's really on Herod's radar also. And the Pharisees are always trying to expose him as a fraud, and things are about to get worse here. So what's actually happening is that when a Pharisee would sit down to eat a meal, he would go through a ceremonial washing, not only of the hands, but oftentimes of the utensils that are used in the meal also. And Jesus hasn't observed this tradition. Now, this is nothing that the scriptures that they had up until this point in time mandated. This was, again, a tradition that had come out of the Pharisees interpreting the law. And seeing this expression on the Pharisees' face, and maybe knowing, maybe intentionally even not going through this ceremonial washing, Jesus is going to use this moment, excuse me, and he's going to use it to confront some critical issues. As a matter of fact, what's about to happen, I think, is one of the main reasons why Jesus came. Obviously, we think about the cross and the resurrection and the forgiveness of sin and new life, all of those things. But one of the things that Jesus did throughout his ministry was he corrected false religious practices. A lot has happened in the culture of the day between the end of the Old Testament and the return from captivity till the time of Jesus, and Jesus confronts these things. So we read this. Jesus sees what's going on, kind of understands that there's a critical spirit there, and the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." You got to imagine that the Pharisees' face was probably, maybe everyone at the table, a little bit shocked. This has gone from polite lunch conversation to obviously something much more significant. And so we read this, and again, we can kind of see the stunned face on perhaps the Pharisee. "You foolish people, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now, as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." Okay, now let me kind of try to explain a bit about what's going on generally at this particular time in the culture while Jesus is there. I would say that what has happened in the lives of many people, particularly the religious leaders, is that religion has overtaken reality and relationship. True faith And from the very beginning of the scriptures, we see this. True faith has to do with a dynamic relationship between a man or woman and God. That relationship requires certain things, particularly after Jesus. It requires that we experience a spiritual rebirth. It requires that there's communication between us and God, which is really what prayer is. I think that it requires an openness, not as if God doesn't know what's going on inside of us, but an openness and an honesty and a reality. And when you think about those things, all of those things have to do with a vital relationship, which is what God is looking for. Now, the human response to all of that is that really in almost every culture, but certainly this was true within the Jewish culture, we create systems or what you might think of as rituals. And originally, those rituals have an intention, ideally, to help facilitate the reality of a relationship with God. What tends to happen is that the ritual becomes an end in and of itself, and oftentimes the reality that it was intended to represent, it's lost. I was thinking about the Old Testament tabernacle. And of course, this was a place that was built to facilitate people's relationship with God. But it was also, when you think about what happened there, it was a place where God showed up and where openness and honesty took place. There was an altar there, and of course, people brought sacrifices for their sins. And if you think about the whole idea of someone bringing a sacrifice, it seems to me that requires some openness and some honesty about the sin in our life. And particularly within the Jewish system, it also represented the need for a substitute. And so in reality, when someone was offering, an animal there in one of the different sacrifices at the tabernacle, what they were partially should have been learning is that animal that was sacrificed was serving temporarily until Christ came as a substitute for themselves. In other words, they really should die as a judgment for sin in their life, but instead that judgment is taken out upon the sacrifice. Well, over time, that symbol became more elaborate, and certainly by the time of Jesus, there were specific ways of offering that sacrifice and rules about how to offer that sacrifice, and different kinds of sacrifices for different kinds of sins, and a certain way of doing things. There were rules and there were rituals. And what we see by the time of Jesus is that the symbols, they really tend to become more permanent. Again, a good example being that the tabernacle was a tent. And of course, during the time of the Exodus, it was moved around as they moved around. And then when they conquered the land, it was placed at Shiloh. But it was just tent. It was mobile. And then over time, of course, during the reign of David and then Solomon, that tent was replaced by a temple, and the temple was much more permanent. I speculatively, I'm not sure God ever wanted a temple. I think that he probably liked the idea that the tabernacle was something that when he moved, it moved. And so what you see here is that something that was designed to, facilitate relationship between the Jews and God, and a symbol that represented that kind of relationship has become quite permanent. People are begin getting religious, is what happens, and they substitute the ritual for the reality. I think that's a really important concept to understand, that over time our rituals become an end in and of themselves, and oftentimes a person can perform the ritual without it having any connection whatsoever to the reality. Again, a good example of that might be going to church. I mean, why do we go to church? Well, the intention is that we go to church to connect with God, obviously to connect with one another also, but the primary purpose is to enhance and facilitate our relationship with God. Well, for some people, that's not what happens. For some people, what happens is they go to church, and it's the going to church that becomes their religious obligation, in a sense, or their religious practice. And, they might leave the building without having any connection with God at all, but knowing that they've gone to church, and it's almost like, they think they've earned a brownie point with God. So again, a means to an end begins to become an end in and of itself. And so whatever the original purpose was of ceremonially washing your hands, which actually might have simply been something for hygiene, it's become such a ritual that the fact that Jesus doesn't do it has now disturbed this group. We're told that, of course, the person that invites him was a Pharisee. And I don't think that any group was more susceptible to this reality of the ritual becoming an end in and of itself than the Pharisees. They represented about 5% of the population. It was a group that really developed in the intertestamental period. You won't find any Pharisees in the Old Testament, and by the time that you begin reading the Gospels, they obviously are playing a very prominent role in the culture of the day. But they tended to be the most rigid and ritualistic and religious of anyone there in Israel. And they created hundreds and hundreds of rules. So, God gave the law. It was really not overly complex. But, for instance, when the law said that we should, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy and take off a day of rest, the result was that, that became a very firm law within the community. And again, the reality was that a pretty simple commandment, honor the Sabbath, rest on it. But they began to make all kinds of rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do and what you were not to work. So they had to begin to define what's work and what's not work. And they even came up with a way of determining how far you could walk on the Sabbath. And it was called a Sabbath's day journey. You maybe have heard that expression before. But they had a specific, distance that you could only go on the Sabbath. Jesus, by the way, and again, since conflict kind of comes up periodically throughout the Gospels, one of the conflicts that seemed to surface on a regular basis was the fact that Jesus did things on the Sabbath that the Jews and their rules, had problems with. They thought, he was a Sabbath breaker. So, you might remember that on the Sabbath, that he and the disciples, they're going through a grain field and they're hungry. So some of the disciples are picking some of the heads of the grain and rubbing them together and then eating the seed of the grain, but they're doing it on the Sabbath, and consequently they get confronted by the Pharisees about, why are your disciples doing that? Because that was really, in their rules, would have constituted work. And maybe they even were traveling further than they were supposed to be traveling. On another occasion, Jesus is in the synagogue, and it's on the Sabbath, and there's a man there that needs healing. And the Pharisees are kind of watching him to see, is he going to break the Sabbath here? And of course, Jesus then confronts them about that, and he heals the man, and they're irate, and Jesus makes the statement that man was not made for the Sabbath was made for man. Now that's a great statement that he makes, and it really illustrates exactly what I'm talking about, that the ritual has replaced the reality, and God gave the Sabbath as a day to rest, and if on the Sabbath, Jesus asked, is it proper to do the right thing on the Sabbath, even if it violates your rules? And periodically throughout the Gospels, you'll see something like that occurring, and it becomes a problem. But that's part of why he's here. I think many times he intentionally orchestrates these events so that he has the ability to really talk about what is the reality intended to be here. So again, there's been this evolution of religion and in ritual that has replaced reality. So what happens here is that Jesus begins to confront the Pharisees about this, and he's getting ready to really unload, to be honest with you. As a matter of fact, up until now, I'm not sure that we have seen this particular side of Jesus, but Jesus, along with being gentle and kind and forgiving and all of those qualities we think about, he had the ability to get angry. The difference being that his anger was a righteous indignation, and he now, in this particular situation, in a sense, he moves into a prophetic mode, because oftentimes when you read through the prophets, you'll see how they confront the people of their day. And Jesus does this by kind of proclaiming 6 woes. And that's an important word in the context of what we're looking at today. Woe was oftentimes part of the prophetic formula for announcing, some kind of correction or some kind of discipline or judgment that was coming. One example would be if you go back to Isaiah chapter 5, there Isaiah 6 different times uses this word to talk about things that are going on in the life of Israel that are wrong. I actually love that passage, because after giving those 6 woes, in the next chapter, Isaiah has an encounter with God in the temple, and instead of pronouncing a woe on Israel or the nations around Israel, Isaiah says, "Woe is me, for I'm a sinful man and I've seen the living God." So this is an important word, and Jesus is going to use it 6 times to introduce issues that need to be confronted with the Pharisees. So, woe number 1, Jesus says this: woe to you, Pharisees. I wish I knew the tone with which this was being said. I wish I knew the volume at which this was being said. I don't know whether Jesus is really belting it out here, or whether he's, kind of saying it in normal conversational tone, but it's the content that's important here. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. And so this first woe, the intended reality of even giving, or the intention behind the tithe, was to be an expression of love for God and for people. And what has happened is it's kind of turned into a way where a person thinks that he has earned points with God because he's been faithful in his giving, and that they can be viewed as a good or a righteous person. The irony is, of course, that Jesus says, well, you're doing that, but the problem is that you have neglected justice and the love of God. What had happened is that, ironically, it had created greed and sometimes, plunder, in a sense, in terms of the sacrifices that were offered. And in the midst of that, there's a lack of compassion for the poor. And I think that the big message to us, by the way, is that we should make sure that in the midst of whatever kind of religious environment we're in, whatever kind of ritual we observe, that we make sure that that the love of God and the love of people doesn't get lost in the midst of all that's going on. I've always loved the expression, some of you have heard me use it before. I don't really know the origins of it, but the expression is that the main thing, in other words, the most important thing, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And again, the most important thing is to keep the main thing, and the main thing here would be love of God and love of one another, that to keep that the main thing, all right? So I think that that's something that we always have to look out for too. We don't want to end up becoming modern day Pharisees, and we don't want to end up simply performing ritual where there is no reality and where there is no relationship. So woe number 1. Woe number 2, Jesus says this: woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces. Well, the intended reality for a person, really becoming a Pharisee or becoming any kind of religious leader was that they were to use that position to serve other people in humility. And the reality is that what this has turned into, whether it's a Pharisee or a scribe or a priest at the temple, was that it kind of turned in, if you became one of these men, that it turned into a big spiritual ego trip. And not only an ego trip, but also tended to create within these people a self-righteousness, which was the thing that rubbed Jesus the wrong way. Again, I think that this is a danger in our own time. I've heard people refer to very successful religious leaders, whether it's pastors or television preachers or whatever, I've heard them referred to sometimes, very successful ones, as charismatic narcissists. And a charismatic narcissist, can not only be very successful in the eyes of the world, but they can also be on major kinds of ego trips. And in America, I think this is a particular danger, just because of the way that we operate, that we've kind of created a class of what I would call Christian celebrities. And I don't think God ever intended us to be celebrities. I'm not sure he ever intended people to be so extremely wealthy that it warped their personality. So again, what's intended to be something that would serve people in love and in humility has really become this big spiritual ego trip, and that's why they're constantly having conflict with Jesus. The third woe is this: woe to you, because you're like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. Now, in a sense, Jesus is calling them unclean, because it was, again, in their kind of, not really the scripture so much, although there are passages that would tend to, could be used to sort of reinforce this. But again, they weren't supposed to walk over a graveyard or over a grave. In another one of the Gospels, I think it's Matthew, it expands this a bit. And in Matthew chapter 23, there's another event like this, where Jesus, during the Passion Week itself, has this encounter with the religious leaders. And again, he proclaims a series of woes. And in one of those, he says, you're like whitewashed sepulchres, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead men's bones and all kinds of things unclean. That was a pretty strong statement being made to the Pharisees, as all of these are. But in a sense, when he says that they're unclean, he's saying that they actually shouldn't be engaged in spiritual activity. And the average person has no clue about the fact that these religious leaders internally are filled with, greed and injustice and a lack of love and self-righteousness. And it's as if people are walking over a grave that was unclean without even knowing that that's what they were walking over. Now, this is not polite dinner conversation, as you can imagine. And you have to, think about what was going on in the minds of these guys that are at lunch, thinking they're going to have a nice lunch, and all of a sudden here's Jesus, really confronting and unloading on them. And so a scribe responds to Jesus. And by the way, the scribes, just so that you know, the word that appears in the text that some versions translate scribe is probably not a very good translation. Now, an accurate translation would be lawyer, except for the fact that a lawyer in that world meant something quite different than a lawyer means in our world. In that world, a lawyer, and again, the reason I say that's probably the better translation is because the word in the Greek, the root of the word is the word nomos, which is the Greek word for law. So lawyer here, someone that practices the law. But the law, you have to remember, the law was the Mosaic law. The law was really the scripture that they had at the time of Jesus, which is what we would refer to as the Old Testament, but Torah, sometimes translated law, although probably a better translation is the word teaching. So a lawyer, and by the way, the New International Version translates the word, the one word, with the expression experts in the law. And so, in a sense, a scribe was sort of a notch above just a plain Pharisee in the religious pecking order. And so this scribe, now talks to Jesus and makes this statement. One of the experts in the law, lawyer, scribe, however your version happens to translate it, answered him, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also." Well, Jesus is going to zero in now on the scribes. And so we read this. Jesus says, and this would be the fourth woe, Jesus replied, "And you lawyers, you scribes, you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them." All right, so the intended reality here. So the scribes, were the experts in the Jewish law, and really what I think their purpose ideally was to teach the law in the way that God intended, with the meanings that God intended. And partially, we know this more from the New Testament, rather than trying to, interpret the law in a way that a person could keep it, but it created a burden in their life. Whereas the intention, I think, of God, that God says really in the New Testament, was that the law was given in order to demonstrate that we really can't keep it, and that we not only need forgiveness, but that we need a Savior, that the purpose of the law was ultimately to point people toward Jesus. But the reality is that the scribes have turned it into this elaborate set of rules that make keeping it this unbearable burden. And so again, something that had the intention of helping people grow in their relationship with God has become a burden that has really pushed people further away from God. And that's why Jesus then makes this pronouncement about what they are doing. He goes on with another woe. Woe to you, again, speaking to the scribes, but I think maybe to the whole group there, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Well, again, what Jesus is basically saying to them is you're just like your forefathers. And when prophets, and a big part of what a prophet did was he would attempt to correct some of these issues, particularly in the area of justice and caring, and sometimes confronting false religion. And they were not popular. This was not a good job. As a matter of fact, the only prophet that I can find, and you can correct me, I welcome your input. The only prophet I can find that anyone ever listened to was the prophet Haggai. And usually when the prophets would have to confront sin in the nation, again, oftentimes they were martyred, they were put to death. And now what Jesus is saying, that's who your ancestors were. and you're just like them. And the fact that you build the tombs for the prophets that your ancestors have murdered is an evidence that you approve of what they did, or in other words, you would have done exactly the same thing, which ultimately they're going to do, because they're not just going to kill a prophet, they're actually going to kill the Son of God. So again, it's a strong statement that Jesus makes that they really would have understood. The final woe, and the sixth woe, is this. Woe to you, and now again it's addressed specifically to scribes or lawyers. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you've taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. Intended reality, again, of the scriptures was to lead into a relationship with God of love and service. And in a sense, now what's happened is that the way that the law is being interpreted, which would have been primarily the function of the scribe, was that they had turned the scriptures into a legalistic system that kept people in a spiritual bondage and led to spiritual death. I think there's a big message for us in this, again, and that is that, God's word, the scriptures, are intended to lead us into a life-giving relationship. But we've got to beware of becoming religious and getting into a legalism about the scriptures that is death-producing and that kind of puts a religious trip on people instead of teaching and interpreting in a way that leads people closer to God. Well, you can imagine that overall this was not a bunch of happy campers. They got mad. They were really angry at Jesus, and you can almost imagine the faces of the men at the table. Maybe they're squirming, or they're angry, or the faces are getting red, veins are bulging in their neck, grumbling to one another, and maybe even rage. And we're told that Jesus gets up and walks out of the house. But when he's outside, they aren't done yet. When Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. So at this point, the hostility and the anger that is been growing as Jesus has been out in his ministry is really beginning to hit a peak that ultimately is going to lead to the cross. In this situation, they're trying to get him to say something that will trip him up. Matthew, in a little bit different context, but I wanted to point this out, Matthew says, but the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. So again, we're at this major turning point, and actually next week together, there's another piece of this that has to do with the more positive side of it. But now, we've reached this point where the religious leaders are actually seeking to kill Jesus. The chronologies of the Gospels they're different, obviously. If in fact the second set of woes that are contained in Matthew are actually referring to this incident, it's just they've been placed at a different point in time. Mark, as early as chapter 3, says that there was plotting going on in terms of how to kill Jesus. But certainly, since we've been kind of going a bit more chronologically and weaving the Gospels together, This, I think, is a critical turning point. Jesus is really beginning his journey to Jerusalem, and while that's going on, the hostility towards him and literally the desire to kill him, it has been growing. So slowly now, Jesus continues on in what will ultimately become that journey, and that's where we'll pick up next week. So I think the big message maybe for all of us today out of this is to keep it real, to remember that we're to be in a relationship with God, a love relationship with God, allowing him to love us, seeking to serve him, and loving one another. I mean, Jesus again has said, and we haven't really landed on it yet, but when he's asked what's the greatest law that we need to observe, responds by saying, well, it's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Again, back to the main thing. So I think look at your own spiritual practices. I think this would be a good thing to do. Are they facilitating relationship, or are they simply making you more religious, and are they becoming more important than the realities they represent? So thanks for tuning in today, and again, a little bit more of a whole different feel to what happens in this event, and we'll pick up there next week.